Hi everyone, I'm Peter from 1KX, and today, a lot of talks about how, we create DAOs, what they are, but for this talk, I'd love to share about, how an early stage investor thinks about DAOs and, how we work with them as part of our portfolio projects. So in this talk, I wanted to really talk about, how 1KX, as an early stage fund thinks about, token networks and DAOs. I also want to talk about sort of like how, we think about the timing of like when, DAO should really be established, right? Or when you should be launching a token network. And, we talk about obviously, 1KX's secret sauce, and how we make our portfolio projects successful. Yeah. And hopefully this is helpful for everyone as framing of like, how to approach an investor perhaps, right? When you are thinking about building a DAO, et cetera. So before then, just for some context, so 1KX, right, we're an early stage fund and we're self-proclaimed token maximalists. This was even the case when, back in the bear market where everyone thought equity is cool and no one cared about tokens anymore. So, we're hardcore token maximalists. We even have shirts, printed with that. I think, so the difference, I think like something about 1KX is that a lot of us are like former entrepreneurs or like people in the space of building DAOs, right? So we have real hands-on experience operating. That's one key factor that, really influences how we work with our projects, which is we get to be, we really want to be hands-on about, with how we build DAOs and how we shape like, the strategy, et cetera. And I think that gives us a unique insight into like, how we build these networks. So we usually sort of lead mostly funding rounds nowadays, like seed and Series A, and, some investments like Index Co-op, Nexus Mutual, ZK-Sync, Variable Connects, Gitcoin, and we sort of like try to work with them very, very closely. Some of them are here in the crowd, say hi. And yeah, I would describe our thinking as like we're very community first, right? Most funds are very, technology driven. We think like it's all about communities. Given that context, our thesis is that the unique innovation of blockchains is actually in the business model. The fact that you can create like large scale technology networks and have them, I guess distribute ownership of that, to, the contributors that actually matter. We think this is like the unique key insight or like value add or, paradigm shift, whatever you want to call it with crypto, right? And the fact that you can sort of coordinate work capital on a larger scale other than we've sort of been able to do before, frictionlessly over the internet's pretty impressive. So that is our core thesis, and that's why we're hardcore, maximalists and token networks and DAOs in general. So, like when should you be launching a token network, right? So we generally provide a lot of advice to a lot of founders all over the place, but, it's effectively like, once you know what sort of work you want your community to really contribute or do, right, you sort of reward them for contributing with tokens. And sort of how we think about token ownership, it's less about rewarding people with money, right, or something of value, but you're rather like redistributing the ownership of the network on a rolling basis to those who provide the most value, right? So you want to be really, really clear about, how, who you want your token holders to be, what success looks like with each stakeholder, and really like reward them for participating in the network, right? And we also take this other approach where we sort of recommend that you should be building a community first as opposed to you launching a token first or like starting a DAO, without a community. And, oftentimes it's like far too much an afterthought. And it's only like when you have a lot of data, once you've launched a product, once you've built a community, you really understand like, how your network distribution should look like, who are your power users, how do you effectively, distribute the ownership of the network to those who matter the most, right? And I guess like some like mistakes projects make, and like in reflection of that is sort of, I think there's a lot of like short-term thinking about like, and lack of clarity around like, who matters in a token network, right? So one thing we try to really work with projects is really clearly identify like stakeholders. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's better. So yeah, like, we try to like really create a lot of clarity around like stakeholders that matter. We really focus on like sort of community building in the sense that most teams that, we talk to, they don't dedicate full-time focus on community building in the sense of like, fostering a real relationship with community members and actually, I guess fostering success with stakeholders that matter, right? There's some sort of like mistakes and like, some like, I guess, directional like thinking that we've been sort of doing and advising projects with. And sort of like, because it's like because it's pretty complicated to like launch a token network, that's sort of where we see ourselves as a fund. So, like pre-launch, we try to help with like, the legal setup, right? There's sort of this process of like, understanding, where do you set up like the entity, right, initially as a team? How do you, design the token network or the DAO itself, right? What contracts do you use? How do you distribute ownership initially? How do you engage the right stakeholders? And there's this side of like community building, which is like, how do you build a strategy to like engage and find success with the right stakeholders, right? Even like we help hire for like the right community leads to come and like help work for our portfolio projects. And sort of after launch, we do a variety of like sort of activities and like support for our projects, including, like we do active network participation, we run arbitrage bots, provide liquidity, we run validators, and this allows us to really like, understand how these networks work underneath the hood, right? So like, it's amazing like how a lot of this stuff doesn't actually work very well, and it's like actually absolute trash once you go below the marketing and the Twitter shells, right? We participate in governance. We set up community funds, for Nexus Mutual. Like we're helping shut down the entity and to effectively render a real sort of decentralized DAO without any sort of legal jurisdictions. We coach community contributors. I think that's one important aspect of like this new age about like, your community members are sort of the extended team members, right? So we work very, very closely, and we like, we engage with like the actual contributors of like Index Co-op, Nexus Mutual. We're like on a first names basis. We have regular syncs. We treat them like core team members of the team, right? Like we, when sort of like projects hit inflection points, we have researchers that, really help with driving strategy around like, go to market. And, if I had to really describe 1KX, it's like, we're not like, I think our DNA isn't like, we're not researchers. We're not like, people who like go write white papers. We're sort of like, we're investors that sort of like think a lot more about like, how do you go from point A to point B in the like most efficient manner, right? And how do you execute? And I think that's sort of much more closer to like the ethos of what we are. And I think like some closing thoughts. I'm just trying to keep this presentation really short, but I think that what's changing. Yeah, so like I think like what's really like happening right now is that it's like I think effectively like before like in the last couple of years it was really just the core team that mattered, right, for projects. But now as DAOs are sort of emerging and like how token networks are like really driving forward like most of these projects nowadays, you have sort of this open participation from the community in the networks. And with that point given, like, it's not just about like building rapport and like supporting the team, but supporting the entire community at large, right? And, like community members are increasingly sort of curate investor participation. So that's something we're like pretty mindful of. And like that drives a lot of our strategy and how we think about supporting, our portfolio projects. And yeah, like we sort of think that like, it's a bit cheesy, but like we think the future of like investing in like token networks is really community driven, right? And I think that's really it. And I hope like I gave you a brief download of how an early stage investor sort of thinks about DAOs and token networks. Yeah, sure. Does anyone have questions?
One question that comes to mind is when you're talking about the relationship between investors and the communities that are more ground up, is the potential of information asymmetry when it comes to the community curating the investors. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Can you clarify? I'm not sure what you mean.
Information asymmetry, as in maybe the objectives and the goals of the community or the knowledge of the community. How does that bridge with when it comes to strategy, go to market, approaching investors? How does that work in the community networks?
Well, I think like the team is the community, right? So they're sort of working with different contributors.
So we feel like this is something that can be filled by other people.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the question is, I'm going to reiterate your question. It's like how do community members understand, like, how do community members engage and like work with investors, right? Like in that sense, because there's this big rift, right? This big information symmetry. How does that work? And I think like, that's one of pointing towards another key problem of a lot of communities. It's when like, core teams treat the community like, external layer of the project versus actually putting everyone on the same level, right? Whereas, in reality, like you're an organization with extended team members, right? and you want to coordinate as a group to achieve shared goals. And realistically, you want to actually decrease the amount of information symmetry as much as you can so that everyone can effectively coordinate as efficiently as they can, right? And this only happens with like, this flatness of information. So I think like that's sort of a key aspect of like designing the community, right? It's sort of all about like, how, really like designing how communities, how decisions are made in a community. It's it's enabling people to participate in governance, in the in-between discussions that matter. I think a really good example is like, you should take a look at Index, right? So a lot of Index, like at the start of Index Co-op, they had like strategy discussions and, biz dev discussion where, normally it would just be the core team, but in fact, they actually let the open community participate in those, and they enable like this flatness of information. And that's something we sort of try to drive in a lot of like communities as well. It's really just like understanding how we can break down information symmetries. And I think naturally everyone becomes like another team member, like extended team. And I think that, we know how to work with that.
Cool. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about building community when your DAO is first launched. Like, what are some important milestones when you're trying to kind of build a fresh community? What are mistakes that you've seen people make? Like, how do you keep it inclusive, but also make sure that the right people are kind of finding your project?
Right. One misconception about communities is that it's not always about inclusion, but rather there's a sort of tension between exclusion and inclusion. You really want to understand like who you want to get involved, right? Or else, it just becomes like, there's too much noise over signal. And early on, what really matters is really like creating like contributors and community members that really understand what the community is about, right? Like fostering the first 20 core contributors, right? Or first 100 true believers. This is really, I think, your goal. And sometimes, you actually want to foster and stay small. Like smallness is, in that sense, is actually like advantage and a strength, right? And I think too many projects try to skip that process of like, of being small. They think smallness is like a weakness. And, in reality, it's a strength, and that's where the strongest foundations for communities are built. That's where values are created, sense of mission is really discovered. It's where ownership over responsibilities of the network capacity is sort of taken by the initial core members, right? It's where, initial stakes of the network are sort of created and owned. So I think like that's the biggest mistake I see is just projects going too wide and, going to the top of the funnel too quickly without really like fostering like ownership first, right? And starting small.
Thanks. Hey, so my question would be around openness and then inclusiveness, I guess. So, traditional companies, they are obviously closed and selectively open. DAOs, what I appreciate is they are open by default. But then my question would be, some industries require some sort of secrecy, like most legal communities within a DAOs would rather not be open, and then some IP-related stuff. But then you want to be as open as possible. How do you balance that? And also in combination to matching tasks and outsiders who are not yet vetted or not in the DAO yet.
So you want to be as open as possible to the people that you want to get involved, right? And how you try to do that is, like you want to have, it's all about curation, right? So you really want to understand who you want involved, but then almost add like, sort of friction in the onboarding process or like the journey to getting involved that filters for the right people, right? So let's say, I'm the Index Co-op community, we're looking for methodologists, individuals who can build DeFi, products, right? Simon there is smiling, but, but effectively, let's say we need to attract people who are very knowledgeable about DeFi, who can build index products, right? They actually, there is the series of steps that actually sort of filter out like participation very naturally, right? There's rigorous levels of testing and, due diligence that's done to who can be a methodologist. And, that's all put in place to create like signal and to protect the community from like information overload. So I think like you want to be very precisely careful about like, what areas of the community you want to sort of curate and like when to do so. It's sort of like a bit of a nuanced topic of like, how that's used.
Any more questions for Peter? Now is your chance to get all your questions on DAOs and community answered by the expert. Yeah?
Hi, Simon.
Come on stage.
We were going to do an interview, but this was even better. It's killed it. Okay, quick question. What do you think the biggest challenges you see for people entering crypto communities are. At Index Co-op, we find it's a very steep learning curve. I think a lot of people show up with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of energy, but then find it very, very challenging to go from just being in the Discord or being in the forums to actually making like meaningful, high leverage contribution.
I think most people who've come from the traditional world are very used to being told what to do and what they cannot do, right? Whereas, the world of Web3 and working in DAOs is a lot like, there's a bunch of like jungle gym bars, and like those are sort of the protocols and the rules that you work around. And, no one can tell you not to swing around those if you want to, right? So it's sort of like, it's a permissionless environment where if you have an idea, you want to work on something, you sort of have to step up and actually, there's like, it's a push versus sort of pull mentality, right? So I think one of the key moments where someone really understands the sort of ethos of working in DAOs is when like they make the first DAO proposal and people support it, and they realize they just made a massive difference to like a large scale community. And once people sort of realize that they can actually create a lot of change, I think that's when they switch on and understand like it's about a push sort of environment, right? Like if you like, I think it's the participation model is like very different. I think that's sort of the initial mental model that people need to get over, right? Like there's no bosses. There's just like really strong, governance, participants who will like, vet and, conduct due diligence on your ideas and execution, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, guys.